Hello, my name is Robin, and I thought the best way to become one of these art tubers that I see on, YouTube sometimes, was to draw my Marvel OC and talk about a paper I wrote in my very last semester of college, which was in December. And I spent months on this paper. It's 26 pages when it's all put together, and I didn't just copy and splice out the parts about Marvel. Because yes, I in fact put the MCU and Marvel Comics and Marvel Animation into my paper. But don't worry, it has to do with my major. I am a history major, and I was in a class called U.S. Foreign Relations 1943 to the present. And my teacher let us, research whatever we wanted to research. So, I decided, hey, during the Cold War, there was a lot of subliminal and non-subliminal propaganda around, and comic books were one of those. So, with permission from my teacher, who is, in fact, a huge fan of the X-Men, Gek, if you're watching, hello, I was able to write this whole paper. Now, it isn't just comic books. I also talked about movies, music, books from the time period and from what is seen today, because there are some things that are shown today that are set in the Cold War, and we see these propaganda tactics. But in an effort to keep this under 40 minutes, we're only talking about the Marvel piece. So, do sit back, relax, and enjoy me talking about my paper to really understand how Stan Lee was able to create all of these storylines past World War II, because during World War II, Captain America was used as the symbol for America to fight, the Allies. And at the very first issue of Captain America, we see Steve Rogers punching the angry mustache model in the face, which, honestly, when I looked at it, pretty cool, if you ask me. But after that, when we entered that period that's slightly pre-Cold War and Cold War itself, there was a shift from, these people are bad, but communism is worse in a way. So, characters started being created to be put in the place where the angry mustache model had been. And, it wasn't done with the sole intention of hurting those of Eastern European descent who unfortunately were under the Iron Curtain, because they really didn't have a say in the matter. He kind of just jumped on that bandwagon because that's what was popular at the time. He's even quoted in a 1978 article that appeared in the Comics Journal that he jumped on the anti-communist bandwagon, cranking out these one-dimensional villains. And some of these characters we have seen again, but some of them we haven't, which obviously shows that they are a product of their time. So when he talks about kind of one-dimensional villains, I think it was meant to mean, one-off people we may never see again, which any of these characters could have been like that had they not popped back up in animated TV shows, the MCU, anything like that. But like the one-dimensional characters he was speaking about were in fact historical figures. Come to find out, the Marvel Comics, in fact, had them fighting Joseph Stalin. That it's a wild concept to wrap my head around, but I digress. Kind of cool as getting to research that. Anyways, my first tangent about Cold War tactic propaganda and at least in a modern sense in the MCU is Black Widow, the movie. Okay, the beginning of that movie starts out, we see two deep undercover Russian spies Alexei and Melina, who Alexei is one of the Red Guardians. I believe there are several. And Melina, who I don't know if she's ever popped up again, but I know that she was debuted in 1983, so still during the Cold War. She is actually Iron Maiden, and in the comics, she can turn herself into, like, she can, like, cover herself in metal. It's kind of cool. Anyways, but the beginning of that movie, we see them stealing government secrets from S.H.I.E.L.D. I say S.H.I.E.L.D. with quotations because even Melina in the, you know, we hear Melina admit that, you know, it was S.H.I.E.L.D., but it was Hydra at the time. So, you know, and then they leave the United States because they're being hunted by S.H.I.E.L.D., and they go and they bring Natasha and Yelena back to the Red Room, which the beginning of that movie is so frightening, honestly, because something like that could be happening in the world and we would never know about it. And if you don't know what I'm speaking of, the beginning of that movie shows the horrors of the Red Room being these girls, these little girls were stolen from their parents or sold to Dreykov, all that kind of stuff. They're trafficked, they're taken away, they're forced into espionage, and in the case of Yelena, they are chemically subjugated to be mindless zombies that will do what they are told in the name of the Red Room, and during the Cold War in the name of the Soviet Union. Now, the Red Room actually stems from a program in the Soviet Union right after World War II called Leviathan. And if you've seen Agent Carter, then you see they go into Leviathan a little bit. Leviathan becomes the Red Room, and then the Red Room works with Hydra. And we hear Melina even say that because she said that, you know, they worked with Hydra to deconstruct the human brain to create that serum that was then given to Yelena. Natasha didn't get that serum. She was trained a different way, and it doesn't justify anything by any means. It's still awful to think that those two little girls went through that. All those little girls went through that, because especially when they are, you know, when they graduate, they have a piece of them stripped away, and it's incredibly upsetting and distressing. But before I roll off on that tangent more, I'm gonna move on. But these characters, you know, Melina, Yelena, Natasha, they all started as villains. Natasha herself, in 1964, when she was introduced, she was a loyal member of the Communist Party. She was a villain, but she became a hero while still being a communist in earlier issues, I believe. But she became that hero because she saw what was happening and she did not want to be a part of it anymore, which, you know, good for her. And I know they don't show it in the MCU, but I believe that when Clint took that shot that he didn't realize the scope of the impact he just made on Natasha, because as we see in the movie too, Natasha blows up the person that she thinks, or that is in charge of the Red Room, and she thinks she gets rid of it, come to find out she didn't, type of thing. But anyways, I'm not here to rant about that. That'll be for another time. But, you know, a comic that features Black Widow and an iteration of the Crimson Dynamo both working for the communist government of Russia at the time was in 2006. That's 15 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Okay? So there is still somewhat of a sentiment built into characters like that we're seeing now. Now, I don't know if that entails anything with the Winter Soldier, because as Natasha has said in the movies, that most of the intelligence community didn't believe he existed. So I don't know the scope of how involved the Winter Soldier was in espionage and, you know, things like that. I know from watching the MCU where he's prominent, it was a long, hard, bad thing that happened to him, and he did horrible things, and as we see in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, he feels horrible about what he did. So until I can get more research about that, that's just gonna stay shelved for now. Also, before moving on to another section of Marvel, there are other characters that haven't been seen again. As I mentioned, the Crimson Dynamo. I believe that the one that I mentioned is the fifth and final one that we've seen, because there are 5 men who play him. I don't know all their names at this moment because I forgot to write them down, but I just know there are 5 of them. There's the Crimson Dynamo. Obviously there's the Red Guardian. I believe there's several of him. There's the Iron Maiden. And not just exclusive to the Avengers, because when we go to the X-Men, actually, they have more characters, okay, that are represented both good and bad, that are communists, and the great thing about the X-Men is that they've always been an allegory for people who don't fit in, okay, and it's used to show that the world around us isn't always sunshine and rainbows, and that comic books are more political than we may realize, which, that being the X-Men being that allegory, so great. And that's actually pointed out in Ramzi Fawaz. I probably said that wrong. It's pointed out in his book, The New Mutants, Superheroes and the Radical Imagination of American Comics, where he points out that comic books can show how policy is affecting the struggles between the people and their governments, and a hero, which a group like the X-Men, and a hero, which a group like the X-Men demonstrate. Okay. But as we see, at least in the X-Men comics from the 70s and the early X-Men animation show, which I used to watch reruns of on Jetix. God, I think I just aged myself horribly right there. Anyways, you meet Colossus, whose real name is Piotr Rasputin, and his younger sister Ilyana, or Magic. They were born in Russia, and they were both members of the Communist Party because it's how they were raised. But they are not seen as a villain. They're seen as a hero. They're heroes. So having 2 people on a team like that were raised communists and use their powers to make the world a better place already was so incredibly risky to even think about in the 70s. Because even past the 60s, past the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that, people were still wary of, people from communist countries. That wasn't just Russia, it was other communist countries. They were still wary. Now, it wasn't out in the open as much, because from the starting in the 50s, we had McCarthyism, where people were throwing their neighbors under the bus because they could be Soviet spies and all that. That kind of trickled down a little bit. It didn't trickle down. It disappeared after a while because, nobody was paying attention to that anymore. So it kind of just faded into the background, but that's still something risky to do. But it's a good thing it happened, because it introduced the fact that not everybody who was communist like that is bad. I mean, if you've ever seen the X-Men animated series, which came out in 1992, in the 8th episode of season 1, The Unstoppable Juggernaut, we actually see Colossus doing construction work, and he turns into his big silver self and breaks down the building, but he rescues Jubilee because she was in the building. But we hear the comments made by the civilian workers, and they were really rude comments. I didn't understand it when I was a kid, because I was probably I'm gonna age myself even more. I was probably about 4 or 5 years old, kindergarten age, watching the show on Jetix, and they were hurling insults at him because he was Russian, and I didn't understand that at the time. But then when I rewatched it as an adult, not just for this project, I was watching it before that, I suddenly realized, oh my god, even past the fall of the Soviet Union, when there was, No more Iron Curtain, no more, you know, all that kind of stuff. They were still very wary about people from Eastern Europe. And I was like, oh, that was the light bulb moment that made me want to write this paper to begin with. So, you know, that episode actually aired a year after the fall of the Soviet Union. So to see that appear, that anti-communism sentiment appear in a show made primarily for children at the time, that was wild to think about and you know, and witness. And I also learned, because I happened to have been at Fan Expo San Francisco last year, and I was able to sit in on a talk with Larry Houston, the guy who created X-Men, the animated series, and he said that season 1 of the X-Men was, you know, storylines that were fresh and original ideas. They were working with characters that had already been established, but he was using fresh story material. So what Colossus experienced was an entirely new thing to be seen in a show like that, which I think is cool. And I really wish I would have went up to Larry Houston and asked him for more quotes for my paper, but I was having a panic attack and my feet hurt because I wore heels. Don't wear heels to an anime convention like that. It's a dumb idea. Anyways, so not only have Colossus and Illyana made numerous appearances in the comics and visual media, because Illyana most recently appeared in the New Mutants and she's in Marvel Rivals, but Colossus, we see Colossus more often. We see him in X-Men the Animated Series, X2, X-Men The Last Stand, X-Men Days of Futures Past, Deadpool, Deadpool 2, and X-Men 97, and Deadpool and Wolverine. So, and we also see Illyana in X-Men the Animated Series, and for a brief second in X-Men 97 when Morph changes into her. But the fact that they created these characters in a time where it was still considered the Cold War, whether people thought about it or not, was quite brave. And the fact that they were experiencing those anti-communist sentiments in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union is incredibly wild. And now as an adult I understand, but like, you know, that was a very brave thing for Stan Lee to do. So also, again, before I continue, I know there are a lot of other characters I'm leaving out, but because I'm reading directly from my paper, they aren't going to be mentioned, okay? So I'm sorry in advance, but had I included all of them, my teacher would have taken more than 2 points off for my paper being over 26 pages, okay? It was 26 pages, and I wasn't gonna make the man read all of that, especially with all of the information I have. Anyway, continuing with my tangent about the X-Men. Okay, so whereas the X-Men had the two characters that were on the X-Men, they're heroes, they also had a villain. So, and there's actually two versions of him. So, Omega Red, or Arkady Rosevich, and it was a man living in the Soviet Union and became Omega Red. One iteration depicts him as a serial killer who survived execution and was experimented on, and another one said he was a serial killer who was arrested and volunteered. Okay, so it depends on which which part you are reading into. All right. But anyways, so we see Omega Red not just in the comics, but we see him in X-Men the Animated Series, and he first appeared in 1993 in season 2, Red Dawn, where he is essentially woken up, because that's what it looked like. They kind of looked like they were keeping him on ice like they do with the Winter Soldier. It's kind of unfortunate, but they brought him back with the hopes of recreating the Soviet Union. And when he finds out that the Soviet Union had fallen, he proceeds to become very, very angry about it and make it everyone's problem. The X-Men come, they save the day. Wolverine has obviously some trauma moments there because he's fought Omega Red, because Wolverine's fought everybody. I think think is how it went. I'd have to rewatch it, but I'm not gonna do that right now because I'm doing this. Anyways, but he made his second and final appearance in 1996 in season 4 the episode A Deal with the Devil, where he is sent by the U.S. government. A man created to take out the U.S. government is sent by the U.S. government to disarm a nuclear submarine off the coast of Hawaii, along with the X-Men. I do believe that the people that went in the sub were Wolverine and Storm, which I don't think Storm liked it because she's claustrophobic. I get it, girl. Anyways, so they're trying to disarm this nuclear sub that has been, under the water since the Cold War, and he's actively trying to remake the Soviet Union as this is happening and fighting with Wolverine and Storm and causing a whole bunch of other issues. But, in the end, the X-Men win because that's what they do. But he's an example of people post-Cold War who still believed in the strength of the Soviet Union. But, that's... I don't know how to explain it, but there are people who genuinely believe that communism was a good thing, and not just the communism on paper, because communism works on paper if you look at it and understand the actual teachings of Karl Marx and not what the definition of communism we've seen put into power. That sounds weird, I know. I'm not a communist. I just look at it from my history professor lens. My history professor? No, I'm not a professor. My history teacher lens. That's what I look at it through, okay? I'm not a communist. Anyways. But he is part of those people who truly believe that rebuilding the Soviet Union is a good thing. But he is also, to people like the X-Men, the little dash of communism that needed to be stamped out, essentially. Okay. It's a wild concept, but the writers knew what they were doing, and somebody obviously paid attention in history class when they wrote that kind of stuff. Anyways, moving on. And to continue with my X-Men and my X-Men tangent. Okay. We've all seen the movie X-Men First Class with very young Charles Xavier and very young Eric Lehnsherr, or Magneto. Okay, so we all know how that movie is dead set in the Cold War. I believe it takes place in 1963 because they stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis from happening. Okay, they stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis from happening, and then Magneto has his little meltdown, and then Charles gets the wrong kind of backshot from him with while McTaggart is shooting at Magneto. It's a whole thing. And if you saw me at SAC Anime Winter this year and I handed you a sticker, hi, because I went as Magneto and I handed out stickers that said Beach Divorce Survivor. Anyways, but even in that movie, I remember watching that for the first time and not getting it, but then when I again used my history teacher perspective, I understood why when Charles Xavier and Mystique were meeting with the government for the first time, that they were so fast to jump on, when Charles was reading their minds, he's like, oh my god, they're communists, get them out of here, arrest them, type of thing, until Mystique shows her powers. It's like, I see that now, and I'm like, okay, wow, yeah, that's how quick they would turn on people. So it was wild. But then we got to see them actually stop the Cuban Missile Crisis and prevent World War III. So I mean, it made it fun in a way. Also, fun fact, one of the ships in the the water during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, when Banshee's flying around and Alex Summers is shooting his chest thingy and Beast is flying the plane. One of those ships is the USS Independence, and my dad served on that ship. So I tell him that fact every time we watch that movie, and he just slowly turns and looks at me usually, and he's like, yeah, I know, now shut up, we're watching it, type of thing. It's kind of funny. Anyways, is that that's the rest of my tangent? Okay, well, I made this video way too long, but now I can talk about my character, because I realized that I've spent the entire time drawing her and not actually talked about her. And I didn't use my history brain when I first created her, because I first created her way back in 2012 when the Avengers first came out, and I was 13 years old. If you've done the math, you should figure out that I'm 26. Anyways, so she's gone through a lot of evolution at this time. She's had quite a few name changes. Her power has stayed the same, but she's had quite a few name changes and quite a few story changes. Okay, I'm gonna preface this by saying that I have been a Stucky shipper since I saw Captain America, the First Avenger, alright? The way that Bucky was looking at Steve when he was all big and buff just solidified it for me. Anyways, and I'm not going to get into my opinion on how I think the end of the MCU for Steve was. Anyways, I'm not going to get into that because I don't want to get attacked, because I might get attacked for my character. So I would rather be attacked for something I created instead of something I cannot change. Anyways, so who I'm drawing is my character. Her name is Maybelline Margaret Barnes. She was born March 8th, 1943, because I think the first Avenger takes place in 1943. She is born a couple days before her dad was born in the 19-teens. So they kind of share a birthday. Anyways, so she is left in the care of, at first, Steve, because who else is Bucky gonna trust than his best friend? But when Steve goes off to, you know, become Captain America, custody goes to Bucky's sister, who I think the only one that's ever mentioned is Rebecca. So Rebecca Barnes. Rebecca Barnes has custody of her. She even brings her to little Zoe to see, well, her name eventually will become Zoe. Anyways, she brings the baby to see Steve when he's off doing his USO show thing, because, you know, Steve's a dad to her, so, you know, why not? So I have a running gag now that in the Smithsonian, next to pictures of Steve in the very first Captain America costume, the showgirl one, there is a tiny picture of Rebecca Barnes standing next to Steve, holding a little baby, who's holding a little American flag that Rebecca's also holding because she's a baby. Anyways, so, and fun fact about Miss Barnes here is she's actually born deaf, so hence the hearing aids. But obviously she's from a time before hearing aids, so she really couldn't hear whatever was being said to her. But, you know, the time that Bucky got with her, she remembers, because she just remembers feeling so loved by these people. She had no idea who they were, but she could feel the love. Anyways, not to get all sappy, because it's gonna get real tragic real fast. Bucky dies. Okay, becomes the Winter Soldier. They find a photo of, when they take him the first time, they find the same photo that's in the Smithsonian. They find that same photo in Bucky's pocket because Rebecca sent a copy to him, because that's his only child, you know. He deserves to see her and to see Steve how he was. Anyways, so, you know, Hydra holds on to that. And once they figure out where this child is, they send 2 people undercover to take her from Rebecca, because, you know, what's more valuable than a child they could mold into a perfect, replacement or perfect keeper of their pet project. Okay, so her name gets changed to Zoe. So Zoe is, she's raised in first Leviathan, because that is the precursor to the Red Room. So she's raised in Leviathan, and when she's about 9 to 10 years old in 1953, they start cryo-freezing her to keep her small, because she's small. So if they need somebody who has to go undercover in a home as a friend, or sneak into a place where, there's vents and whatnot, she's the perfect size. So they cryo-freeze her to keep her small. They take her out for short stints of time, and then those stints keep getting longer, and eventually she is cycled through the Red Room not more than once, because she knew better than to screw up and be sent back through, so she had to be perfect every time. And that leads her to becoming essentially Dreykov's little pet for a time. And, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's quite tragic, but she endures a lot of trauma, a lot of pain. I mean, she can't hear up until hearing aids are available to her. So she had to read lips and emotions. So she's actually quite good at that. But, she also sustained a very, very bad head injury that has led to bruising on her brain. So a side effect of that is that she has seizures. So now she has to take, medication to manage it. But, she's still kept as Dreykov's little pet up until, Natasha blows him up. But, she knows who Natasha is, but obviously she wasn't allowed to, form connections with other people, so she doesn't know her. But she's also on loan to Hydra a lot of the time, so she is let out to, guard people or help with projects and all that kind of stuff. So when she is finally rediscovered again, she is guarding Wanda Maximoff and Pietro Maximoff at the beginning of Age of Ultron. So, and Wanda tries to make friends with her, but it doesn't go very well, obviously, because Zoe's not very good at social interactions. She's quiet, she's timid, she's observing, she's anxious, she's got a lot going on. But when Wanda and Pietro are sent out to, stop the Avengers, she is too, which results in her being in a standoff with Natasha and Clint. And Natasha's trying to talk her down. She's trying to get her, hey, sweetheart, put the gun down. Let's just talk. We don't want to hurt you. Clint's doing the same thing, because MCU Clint is now in dad mode seeing a small child. But it doesn't go over well, because she kind of gets thrown into a tree by the Hulk on total accident. And Bruce feels horrible after that when they're back in the ship and he sees a small girl kind of just strapped to a gurney. Anyways, so, she's there present for Age of Ultron, but she's not fighting because she is in such bad shape, physically, mentally, that they kind of just keep her in a medical room. They're keeping an eye on her. Steve is trying to figure out who she is. And, she won't talk to them. She doesn't know them. She's scared of them. Natasha tries to talk to her, but it doesn't go over well, because when she sees Natasha, she also panics, because Dreykov's had instilled in her that Natasha is a traitor, and, you shouldn't be talking to traitors. It's going to get you, unalived. Anyways, so she's quite scared, but, by the time the next one rolls around, she's a bit better. She's talking. She feels a lot safer and whatnot. And they they leave out telling her about Bucky, not on purpose, but because they don't actually know if she is 100%, Steve's, the child that Steve had left behind, type of thing. So they don't really know. But she goes through everything with them. When Civil War happens, she is so, she by then understands who Bucky is, and that she knows him as the Winter Soldier. She doesn't know him as Dad. She knows him as the Winter Soldier. So to her, it's quite scary. But when they're fighting like they were at the end, and she is now suddenly a fugitive, it creates a lot of stress for her, because she has no idea why all of a sudden the adults that she had once trusted are turning on her, because Tony had been so nice to her and all of this. And it's a mess for her, and it leaves her a little emotionally kind of messed up. And then when Bucky goes back under the ice in Wakanda, she's kind of left with Steve, and we really don't know what Steve was doing between when Civil War ends and when Infinity War begins. So I have had it where she went with Natasha, but that doesn't always work in my favor a lot of the time. So it's up for debate. But by the time Endgame rolls around, she is just ecstatic that she gets to be back with her dad, and she understands who he is, and that what he did was not fully his choice, just like what she did was never fully her choice. And she goes through the motions with the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and she unfortunately had to witness what John Walker did, and it created a little more trauma for her, because to her that's Papa Steve's shield, and he just ruined that legacy for it, type of thing. It had nothing to do with that, Sam or anything. Just what John Walker did was god-awful. And then, when the Dora Milaje are beating the ever-loving snot out of him, she jumps in. She's kind of a chaos gremlin once she's no longer emotionally and physically weak, how she was in the beginning. She's chaos gremlin, which at times Bucky is like, there's no way this kid could be mine, and then she'll say or do something, and he's like, nope, that's mine. And at times when she says stuff that reminds him of Steve, she'll be like, well, that's Steve's daughter right there, like, that kind of thing. But it's not fully it's fully fleshed out, but not fully fleshed out in a time where I can explain it fully and have it make sense, because my little autism brain can't compartmentalize right now to get it right. Anyways, but the look that I'm drawing her in is supposed to be along with season 2 of Marvel Rivals, where they're doing the Hellfire Gala, because I'm like, oh, that would be cool if she had her own little outfit. And I went through several different designs before I settled on this suit dress like combo thing, because I originally saw it for like a wedding, but then I'm like, I think she could rock that. I think she could. So, but yeah, no, that's her gist. There's a lot more, and I obviously can't get my brain to work right to put it together, but also I have it that she's a member of the Young Avengers at one point, and she's in fact dating Kate Bishop towards the end, but that's for another time. And here's our finished product. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me on Instagram.